A peaceful morning disrupted. It was early June in the quiet, sun-drenched town of Bellwood, Texas. The town, nestled among sprawling meadows and old oak trees, had long prided itself on being the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. The mornings were punctuated only by the occasional chirp of birds and the hum of neighbors' lawnmowers. Everyone knew everyone, and the most scandalous event in recent memory had been old Mrs. Whitaker's dog digging up a neighbor's flower bed. But that morning, Bellwood was about to witness something no one in the sleepy town would ever forget. James Harrison, a retired construction worker in his mid-60s, had started his day just like any other. Known fondly around town as Big Jim, due to his towering stature and hearty laugh, James had spent most of his post-retirement days tending to his garden and fishing in the small pond behind his house. The pond wasn't much, just a murky little patch of water where a handful of bass swam lazily around, but it was James's sanctuary. He'd often call it his little piece of heaven. On this particular morning he sauntered out of his back porch in his plaid shirt and old work boots, a cup of coffee steaming in one hand and his fishing pole in the other. The air smelled faintly of pine and freshly cut grass, and the ground was still damp from the overnight drizzle. As James approached the pond, something peculiar caught his eye. There, near the edge of the water, the soil seemed disturbed. At first, he thought it was just raccoons digging up frogs again. Setting his coffee on a rock, he leaned closer, squinting at the patch of mud. That's when he saw it, a small pale object protruding from the ground. It shimmered faintly in the morning sun, stark against the slick dark earth. Damn kids must have buried some junk again, James huffed to himself, annoyed. Over the years, neighborhood teens had been known to use his land as a shortcut or occasionally, a secret hangout spot where they left behind beer cans and cigarette butts. But this was different. Grabbing a nearby spade, James crouched down and began to dig. It only took one shallow scoop before the truth hit him like a freight train. The pale object wasn't trash, it was bone. For a moment James froze. His heart thudded against his chest like a sledgehammer as realization crept in like the chill of an autumn breeze. This wasn't just any bone. This was human, a femur, unmistakably human. "Good God, no!" James stammered, stumbling backward. His coffee cup tipped over, spilling its contents onto the mossy ground, but he didn't notice. His hands trembled as he knelt again for a closer look, as if hoping his eyes might deceive him. Yet the sickening truth remained, half buried in mud and shadow. Adrenaline rushed through his veins as the idyllic morning shattered into fragments of fear and urgency. He shot up to his feet, nearly tripping over himself as he sprinted toward the house, yelling for his wife, Martha. "Martha, call the cops! Jesus, Martha, call the cops right now!" Martha, startled by the volume of his voice, dropped the tea kettle she had been holding. "Jim, what on earth? What happened?" she asked, rushing to the back door. The look on her husband's face drained all color from her cheeks. I found bones, Martha. Out in the yard, near the pond. I think it's—" James couldn't finish his sentence. He swallowed hard, his words stifled as if saying them out loud might make it worse. "Just call 911, okay? Now!" Within minutes, the peaceful stillness of Bellwood was replaced by the sharp wail of police sirens. The blue and red lights illuminated the Harrisons' backyard as neighbors came outside, rubbing sleep from their eyes and asking each other what could possibly have happened. Officers taped off the area and began combing through the soil with gloves and tools, their professional demeanor contrasting sharply with the unease on their faces. Bellwood was no stranger to rumors, but this was something different, something dark. The finding of what looked to be human remains was enough to send ripples of alarm through the tight-knit community. People whispered to one another in hushed tones. Was it just an accident? An old, forgotten tragedy? Or was it something far worse? For James Harrison, the man who always prided himself on taking life one sunny day at a time, his little piece of heaven had suddenly become ground zero for a chilling mystery, and he had no idea that what lay beneath the earth would soon uncover truths far more sinister than anyone in Bellwood could have imagined. Police step in. The first mystery. The Bellwood Police Department wasn't used to dealing with bone-chilling discoveries like this one. The small-town police force, staffed by just a handful of officers, were more accustomed to resolving parking disputes and attending to the occasional shoplifting claim at the local hardware store. But as the call came through that human remains were found near the Harrison property, things quickly shifted into high gear. Officer Karen Mitchell, the dispatcher on duty, had to take a deep breath before dialing Captain Daniel Carter's number. A no-nonsense man in his early 40s with piercing green eyes and an intimidating demeanor, Captain Carter had been with the force for over a decade, but nothing in his career had quite prepared him for what lay ahead. "Dan, we've got something big," Karen said over the phone, her voice trembling slightly. "What is it, Karen?" he asked, setting his coffee mug down mid-sip. The tone in her voice told him it wasn't the usual noise complaint from Main Street. "Human remains, found by, James Harrison, his place near the pond." Her words lingered as if she struggled to say them out loud. "Human remains?" Carter repeated, his brow furrowing. He grabbed his keys from the desk and slipped into his jacket. "All right, I'm on my way. Radio Rourke and the rest of the team. Tell them to meet me at Harrison's in 10. Within minutes, 2 black and white police cruisers were parked haphazardly outside the Harrison residence. The bright morning light no longer felt warm and comforting. Instead, a chill seemed to linger in the air despite the Texas sun's bold attempts to shine it away. Blue and red lights flickered across the manicured hedges as Captain Carter stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his belt and nodding to the officers already on the scene. James Harrison was sitting on the porch looking pale and visibly shaken. His wife Martha stood beside him, holding his hand while periodically glancing toward the pond with a look that mixed fear and confusion. Carter approached cautiously. "Mr. Harrison," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "You found something near the pond?" James looked up. His face was pale, his hands still trembling slightly as he wiped invisible sweat from his forehead. Yeah, it's out there," he stammered, motioning toward the pond. "Something's buried. A bone. A big one. It's not an animal. It's human, I swear." Martha chimed in, her voice cracking. "He's not making this up, officer. I saw it too. It doesn't look right." Carter nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "We'll handle it, ma'am. If it's all right, I'll have my team take a look. You two stay here, inside the house. You've already been through enough this morning." As Officer Rourke and a forensic technician jogged past him toward the pond, Carter called after them, "Rourke, bag and mark whatever you pull up. I want a clean site. Nothing gets touched without documentation." "Got it, Captain," Rourke replied, pulling on a pair of gloves. The technician, Lauren Becker, knelt by the disturbed patch of soil and began gently brushing away loose mud with the practiced precision of someone who'd spent years working crime scenes. Within moments, a fragment of pale, porous material emerged. Definitely bone, unquestionably human. Lauren glanced over her shoulder and gave a grim nod. "We've got something here," she said firmly, her voice breaking the tense silence. Captain Carter approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the damp grass. As he stooped to get a closer look, his jaw clenched. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. "What are we dealing with, Lauren?" She sighed, pointing at several visible details on the fragment. "Femur. Judging by the size and density, it's adult. Relatively fresh too, meaning this didn't come from some old burial site. I can't say much more without a proper lab analysis, but I'd bet this person hasn't been in the ground more than a year." Carter straightened and glanced toward the Harrison house. James was peeking out the window, his anxious gaze fixed on the group by the pond. The look on his face wasn't just fear, it was guilt, the kind of look that said he wished he hadn't stumbled across something so horrible. "Bag it," Carter ordered, taking a step back, "and keep digging. If this isn't the only piece out here, I need to know before noon." As Becker and Rourke methodically expanded the search area, a small crowd of neighbors began gathering along the property line. Bellwood wasn't the kind of town where you could hide an incident like this. Word spread faster than wildfire, and soon half the neighborhood was whispering conspiratorially over cupfuls of coffee. "Human remains?" one woman gasped, clutching her terrier close to her chest. "Here? In Bellwood? I mean, this stuff happens in big cities, not here." "Think it's a murder?" another man asked, adjusting his trucker hat. "Don't jump to conclusions," an older gentleman retorted. "It could be anything. Maybe some poor lost soul had an accident and wandered out here." But the whispering grew more and more animated with every shovelful of soil that Becker and Rourke unearthed. Bits of fabric began to emerge, small, muddy scraps that were once brightly colored. Next came what looked like a piece of metal, rusted and bent but unmistakably the buckle of a belt. Minute by minute the evidence began to paint a darker and more disturbing picture. Eventually Becker stood and wiped her forehead, leaving a streak of mud across her face. "Captain, you're going to want to see this," she called out. Carter strode closer, and what he saw made his stomach twist into knots. A small fragment of a human skull was now visible in the loosened dirt, followed by a scattering of smaller bones nearby. He exhaled sharply through his nose and turned to the onlookers. This area is now a crime scene. I want everyone back behind the police line, now." He motioned for Officer Mitchell, who had just arrived, to set up a larger perimeter. "Get me the sheriff's office and call the state crime lab. We've got a potential homicide scene here. And Mitchell, keep the press out of this until we get all the facts." From inside the Harrison house, James watched as more and more officers arrived, their faces growing grimmer by the minute. He turned to Martha, his voice shaky. "What if this is bigger than we think? What if this isn't just one body?" Martha placed a hand on his arm, though her own fingers were trembling. "We need to let them do their job, Jim. Whatever this is, it's not our burden to carry anymore." Outside, Captain Carter stood by the edge of the pond, staring out across the murky water. With every piece of evidence uncovered, the tranquil image of Bellwood slipped further away, replaced by something darker, something that felt like it didn't belong in a place like this. Deep down, Carter knew this wasn't going to be a simple case. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long, ominous shadows across the yard, he whispered to himself, "What the hell happened here?" The chilling discoveries. As the early morning stretched into the afternoon, the once pristine backyard of the Harrisons was transformed into a hive of forensic activity. Police officers moved methodically, lining the edge of the pond with yellow caution tape and erecting makeshift tents to shield the pit from the punishing Texas sun. Captain Carter stood nearby, watching his team unearth a chilling secret that had long lurked beneath the soil. Lauren Becker, the forensic technician, had her hands deep in the muck. What had started as a femur, the initial horrifying find, was now being pieced together into a bigger, far darker puzzle. "Captain, I've got something else here," she called out sharply, crouching low over the hole. Her voice was steady but strained, as though she was trying to suppress the uneasiness growing in her chest. Carter strode over, adjusting the brim of his hat. "What is it?" he asked, already bracing himself for the answer. Lauren brushed away the surrounding dirt carefully, exposing more pale material beneath the dark sludge. It was unmistakably a human ribcage, bent unnaturally and partially crushed by the weight of the earth. Her gloved fingers hesitated for a moment before continuing. "This isn't the same individual as the femur we pulled out earlier," she said, a grim certainty in her tone. "The size and condition are different. Captain, I think we're dealing with more than one body." Carter's jaw tightened as he straightened up, looking out over the pond. The serene setting, the gentle lapping of water against the bank, the whispers of leaves stirred by the breeze, was all a cruel contradiction to the horror being dug up just feet away. "Rourke!" Carter barked, motioning toward one of his officers. "Expand the perimeter! Rope off this entire damn area! I don't want a single footprint messing this up. This is a homicide scene, no doubt about it." "Yes, sir," Rourke replied, hurrying off to gather more personnel and tape. As Becker carefully lifted the partial ribcage out of the soil, something else caught her eye. A piece of fabric, soaked through and caked with mud, was tangled among the bones. She examined it briefly before holding it aloft for the captain to see. "It's clothing," she said. "Or at least it used to be. Looks like a shirt or maybe a jacket." "Bag it," Carter ordered. By late afternoon, the hole by the pond had grown deeper and wider. What had been a single horrifying discovery was now turning into the makings of a graveyard. "Captain!" someone called from a few yards away. It was Officer Rourke, standing near a clump of bushes at the far end of the pond. He was holding up what appeared to be a long, metal object, rusted and bent, but unmistakable in shape. "Found this buried shallow, just under the surface. It's a shovel," Rourke said as Carter approached. "And it's seen some heavy use. Looks like dried mud or, hell, maybe blood on the edge." Carter rubbed the back of his neck, a sinking feeling taking hold. "Bag it and get it to the lab ASAP," he instructed. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of unease. By now, word had spread far beyond the Harrison property. Curious neighbors had gathered along the edges of the property line, their hushed conversations blending into a low hum of anxiety and speculation. "3 bodies," Carter overheard someone whisper, though the number was still unconfirmed. "Can you believe it? 3! "I heard it might be 5, another muttered, clutching their child protectively. "Jesus, who would do something like this?" "Do you think it's that serial killer from upstate we heard about on the news?" a woman's trembling voice asked. Carter ignored the speculations, though his stomach churned at the possibilities swirling around in his head. He turned his focus back to the task at hand. "Captain," Lauren Becker called again, her voice sharper this time. "You need to see this." Carter moved quickly to join her by the dig site. She pointed to something protruding from the freshly unearthed dirt, a fragment of what looked like a human skull. Its surface was fractured and stained from time spent beneath the earth. Nearby, more bones were starting to peek through the disturbed soil. "That makes at least 3 individuals," Becker said quietly. Carter crouched down, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. He ran a hand over his face, the lines of exhaustion already beginning to show. "This wasn't just some panicked act of violence," he said. "This was planned." Becker nodded in grim agreement. The depth, the arrangement, the way the bodies were buried. Yeah, this wasn't a hasty burial. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. As the sun began setting, washing the yard in an eerie orange glow, the dig site continued to yield fragments of bone, scraps of fabric, and other bits of chilling evidence. A belt buckle was recovered next, followed by pieces of shoes that seemed to belong to completely different individuals. Carter stood off to the side, looking pensive as he made notes in his brown leather notebook. He knew they were looking at more than just a single murder or an accidental death. This was something far bigger and far darker than Bellwood had ever seen before. By the time twilight crept in, the dig crew laid out evidence bags on a folding table beneath the tent. 5 distinct sets of human remains had been confirmed. Each one was tagged as Victim A, Victim B, and so forth, their full identities still a mystery. One of the younger officers, visibly pale from the day's discoveries, murmured to Carter, "What do you think happened here? Some gang stuff? Or maybe that guy James Harrison's involved somehow?" Carter shook his head firmly. "Harrison didn't do this. I saw the look in his eyes. He's just as horrified as the rest of us. This is someone who's used to doing things like this, someone who knew exactly where to dig and when to stop." "So, a serial killer?" the officer asked, the words hanging heavily in the air. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back toward the Harrison house. James was seated at the kitchen table inside, staring blankly at a cold cup of coffee while Martha rubbed his shoulder and spoke softly. "Maybe," Carter finally said, "or maybe something worse." By the end of the night, the first round of collected evidence had been loaded into vans and taken to the State Police Crime Lab. But only after Carter gave strict instructions to handle the remains with the utmost care. The investigation had only just begun, and Carter vowed to uncover how and why such horror had found its way to Bellwood. As he walked back to his cruiser, Carter paused to glance once more at the pond. Beneath its still, reflective surface, he couldn't help but wonder if more secrets lay hidden. The thought made him shudder as he muttered under his breath, "Hell of a way to start a case." Signs of a serial crime. As the forensic team and officers continued their search into the night, a grim pattern began to emerge. What had initially seemed like a tragic, isolated incident now began to take on the shape of something far more sinister, something calculated. Captain Carter had retreated to a makeshift command post under a portable tent, complete with maps, notes, and an underpowered lamp casting long shadows on the table. Sergeant Lauren Becker stepped in, pulling off her gloves and wiping sweat from her forehead. "Captain," she said quietly, her voice tight, "we've uncovered more." Carter set down his pencil and straightened. "More bones?" he asked cautiously, though he already braced himself for her answer. Her nod was slow, cautious. "We've located another complete skull and additional fragments scattered about. These aren't random, they weren't just tossed into the ground in a panic. Whoever did this, they went to great pains to hide their work, but—" she hesitated. "But what?" Carter pressed. "But they knew exactly what they were doing," Becker finished, her tone dropping into something heavier. "The bodies weren't just buried, they were arranged." Carter's expression darkened. "Arranged how?" Becker pulled down an evidence photo from her clipboard. The image showed several pieces of skeletal remains forming a loose circular pattern beneath the dirt, almost like the way someone might lay stones around a fire pit. Deep cuts on many of the bones suggested some form of violence, but the eerie symmetry indicated intent. "Positioning of the remains suggests deliberation," she explained, "and there's no chance it's any kind of pre-colonial burial or something historical. These people were put here no more than 6 months ago." Carter leaned over the photograph, his jaw tightening as he scrutinized the details. "You're saying this wasn't just hiding bodies, it's systematic?" Becker hesitated for a moment, then nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm saying." By the next morning, the discoveries hadn't slowed. Officers uncovered several more personal items among the unearthed dirt, scraps of clothing, a single battered shoe, and a wallet containing faded photographs of a smiling family, now slick with mud. Sergeant Rourke handed the wallet to Carter. "Found it near Victim C," Rourke said. "Looks like it belonged to someone young, judging by the photo. Kid couldn't have been older than 25. Carter flipped open the wallet and felt the weight of the photograph in his hand. The smiling face of a young man in his prime stared back at him, likely not far from his last moments alive. A sick nervousness churned in his stomach. "There's no way this was random," Carter muttered. "Rourke, what about the rest of the scene?" "It's messy," Rourke admitted, "but it's consistent. Whoever did this used the same tools, same methods. The dig points, we're finding similar disturbances in the soil in those locations. Tracks suggest a shovel was used, and a heavy hand at that." "More than one shovel?" Carter asked. "Doesn't seem like it," Rourke replied, "but there are a few scattered drag marks leading toward the pond from the dirt path. Key thing is, everything looks methodical. They knew this spot, knew exactly where to dig." Carter processed the statement quietly, the wheels turning in his head. This wasn't a crime of passion or some random act of impulse, it was calm. Planned. "Captain," Becker called out from near the excavation site, "we found traces of diesel oil. Looks like someone drove a vehicle near the property recently." Carter furrowed his brow. "A truck? A van?" "Hard to say," Becker shrugged. "But the tracks near the pond matched some heavy treading. It had to be something durable, likely built to carry heavy loads." Carter felt a lump forming in his throat. "What kind of monster drives out here, digs graves and dumps people like this?" he murmured, almost to himself. By noon, Carter called an impromptu meeting under the tent. His team gathered around, their faces grim with exhaustion and unease. "What do we have so far?" Carter asked, addressing the room. Becker spoke first. "We're dealing with multiple victims, more than 5 at this point. Age range varies, but we're seeing adult remains primarily. Based on the damage to the bones, gashes, fractures, it's possible blunt force trauma or stabbing caused the deaths." "Not just possible," Rourke interjected, holding up some preliminary notes from the lab. "Probable. We found a rusted knife edge in the shallows of the pond and soil samples came back positive for traces of blood. It's bad out there, Captain." "What about their identities?" Carter leaned forward, his eyes sharp. Becker sighed. "We've tagged some personal effects that could lead to leads. A shoe, a necklace, and that wallet. But most of it's decayed. We'll get DNA analysis started as soon as we can ship these to the state lab." One of the younger officers, Officer Hayes, raised his hand hesitantly. Do we think it's connected to that missing persons list from a couple towns over?" "Possibly," Carter replied. "Several of the victims fit descriptions of people who were last seen roughly within the time frame we're looking at. 6 months to a year, same county, same demographic." "But Captain," Rourke interrupted, "if this really is connected, then we're saying this guy's not just killing people. He's choosing them. Something's tying these victims together." As Carter mulled over the evidence, flashes of cases he'd read about during his training in Quantico flooded his mind. Cases from decades ago of methodical killers who treated victims like pieces of a puzzle. Humans reduced to nothing more than objects. The killer in Bellwood wasn't sloppy, he wasn't reckless. He was careful and deliberate, always staying one step ahead. "We're dealing with a serial offender," Carter finally said out loud, breaking the heavy silence. "This many bodies in one place? The planning? The staging? He put them here for a reason." The words hung heavily in the air. No one said a word for a moment, the realization settling in like a suffocating weight. Bellwood wasn't just dealing with a crime, they were dealing with a monster. "Sir," Hayes whispered, breaking the silence hesitantly, "if we're right about this, how many others do you think there might be?" Carter glanced at the pond, its still murky waters reflecting in his grim, tired eyes. He didn't answer. By late afternoon, the evidence gathered from the pond and surrounding woods was loaded into vans and shipped to the state lab. But as Carter stood at the edge of the crime scene, looking out over the horizon, he couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet everything had gotten. The breeze fell still, and even the crickets seemed silent. A connection, a trail of ruthless loans. Captain Carter's team was stretched thin as the dual tasks of untangling physical evidence and tracing back the victims' lives collided into one mounting challenge. For days, investigators dug through municipal records, combed through missing persons reports, and interviewed anyone in Bellwood who might have known the people buried beneath the Harrison property. Then, on a sweltering Wednesday afternoon, the first real lead fell into their laps. "Captain," Officer Hayes said, his voice slightly shaking as he hurried into the command tent with a folder clutched tightly in his hand. The young officer's normally confident demeanor looked frayed. Carter, seated at a folding table surrounded by stacks of case files, barely looked up. "What have you got?" he asked, his voice weary but sharp. "I think we've found something. A pattern," Hayes said, placing the folder in front of him. 3 of the identified victims, Victim A, Victim C, and Victim E, had something in common. They all had recent financial troubles and, here's the kicker, they owed money to the same name. That got Carter's attention. He leaned forward, opening the folder to sift through the documents inside. Among them were bank notices, credit card bills, and, highlighted in garish yellow marker, handwritten records from a private lender. Morris Blake, Carter read aloud, his tone laced with both intrigue and disdain. Who the hell is Morris Blake? Becker, standing nearby, crossed her arms as she joined the conversation. Sounds like one of those shady loan sharks, quiet, under-the-radar types, she said. What kind of money are we talking here? Hayes flipped through the folder, pointing to one page. Nothing massive, amounts ranging from a few thousand to 10 grand, but the interest rates are insane, way above the legal limit. This guy isn't running a legitimate business. Carter leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. So Blake loans out small amounts at crippling rates, and when they can't pay him back, they vanish, Hayes finished grimly. For a moment the tent was silent, save for the constant buzz of fans blowing humid air across stacks of paperwork. Tell me we've got something else on this Blake guy, Carter said, breaking the silence. Hayes nodded quickly. He's been living here in Bellwood for years, though no one seems to know much about him. Records show he's got a house on the outskirts of town, a real fixer-upper kind of place, but he doesn't show up much in public. Doesn't seem like the neighborly type, if you ask me. Becker smirked faintly, though her expression remained tight. Sounds about right. Guys like this, they don't exactly host barbecues on the weekends. Does he have a business license? Anything legit on paper? Carter asked. No, sir, Hayes replied. No legitimate storefront, no official lending operation, everything's done off the books. It's mostly word of mouth. People desperate for quick cash, you know. Word spreads that Blake can't help. They reach out, and he reels them in. Carter exhaled sharply through his nose. And when they can't pay back the extortion rates, we're looking at what? Threats? Intimidation? Or worse, Becker added darkly. Rourke entered the tent then, a grim expression on his face. You're going to love this, Captain, he said dryly, throwing a bundle of papers onto the desk. We started digging into reports of violence in the area, complaints that never made it anywhere. Turns out, we've got a handful of locals who've filed reports about someone fitting Blake's description. What kind of reports? Carter asked, already sensing the answer wouldn't sit well. Threats, lots of them, Rourke replied. One woman claimed Blake showed up at her door with a crowbar and smashed her porch steps to send a message. Another guy said his truck tires were slashed after he missed a payment. And no charges? Becker asked, frowning. Rourke shook his head. No one wanted to press charges. From what I gather, they were terrified. Blake's the type who knows how to make an example out of people without leaving a trail that points back to him. Or at least, he was. Carter reached for the phone on the table. Let's find him before someone else ends up in the ground. A plainclothes team was sent to Blake's residence that afternoon. The property was just as Rourke had described, a dilapidated old farmhouse at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown weeds and a rusty chain-link fence. The windows were dark, the mailbox overflowing with unopened letters. He's either in there or long gone, Rourke said under his breath as he surveyed the scene from the passenger seat of an unmarked car. Carter, seated behind the wheel, gripped the steering wheel tightly as his jaw flexed. If he's smart, he's already running. Guys like Blake know when to cut their losses. Let's move. The team fanned out across the yard, cutting through the tall grass with weapons drawn. But as the officers approached the front door, it became clear that Morris Blake wasn't home. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint creak of wind-blown shutters. Inside, the scene was a mix of chaos and cold calculation. Unpaid bills and crumpled receipts littered the kitchen counters, along with empty beer cans and cigarette butts. But it was the small, locked safe in the corner of the living room that seemed to radiate importance. "Rourke, get the bolt cutters," Carter ordered. Minutes later, the safe was cracked open, revealing a trove of handwritten records, names, amounts, dates, pages upon pages of meticulous loan tracking that stretched back years. Among the list were the names of every confirmed victim found at the pond. "Jackpot," Rourke muttered. Becker stared at the papers, her stomach twisting. "Carter, this isn't just about unpaid debts. He kept these like trophies." Carter's expression darkened. He didn't just take their money, he took their lives. The discovery sparked a manhunt across the state of Texas. Blake, now the prime suspect in what was shaping up to be serial murder, had vanished without a trace. But as the investigation continued, one question burned in Carter's mind with unrelenting intensity. Was this just business to Blake? Just a violent way to collect on debts? Or was it something more twisted, something personal? Outside the tent, the ever-lingering crowd began murmuring louder as word of Morris Blake's potential involvement spread through Bellwood like wildfire, and for the first time in decades the small, sleepy town no longer felt safe. The prime suspect, Morris Blake. Morris Blake wasn't a name most people in Bellwood spoke about openly, not because he was popular or admired, but because his mere existence sent a chill through the tight-knit community. He wasn't the friendly neighbor next door, or the guy chatting over barbecue and beers at the local diner. Morris Blake was the shadow lurking at the farthest edges of town, the kind of man whose presence made people instinctively lock their doors at night. Blake had lived on the outskirts of Bellwood for years, residing in a deteriorating farmhouse surrounded by tall grass, as if the land itself was trying to swallow him whole. The house, with its faded blue paint peeling in long strips and windows dark and heavy with grime, looked like something out of a ghost story. Despite the ominous state of his property, Morris kept a low enough profile to stay largely under the radar. That is, until the investigation into the bodies found near the Harrison Pond pointed directly to his doorstep. The connection between Blake and the victims might never have been discovered if it weren't for the records found in his safe. Meticulous handwritten accounts detailing the money he had lent out, the exorbitant interest rates he charged, and the names of those who had failed to pay him back. It painted a picture not of a simple loan shark, but of a man who operated with terrifying precision, mixing calculated cruelty with a twisted sense of control. Morris Blake, Captain Carter muttered as he stared at the handwriting on the documents spread out across his desk. The pen strokes were sharp, angular, as if written by someone who had never relaxed a day in his life. "What kind of name you got yourself out here?" he added under his breath. "Typical small-town terror," Sergeant Rourke chimed in without looking up from another record. "I mean, hell, Captain, take a look around town. People don't even want to say his name when you ask. They don't know if they'll catch his bad luck or end up on his bad side. Say what you will, Blake made sure people stayed scared." "Scared enough to stay silent," Carter responded. As the investigation unfolded, a darker picture of Morris Blake's reputation began to emerge from interviews with Bellwood residents. People whispered about him in hushed tones, their faces lighting up with suspicion and fear when his name was mentioned. James Mather, the owner of the auto repair shop on Main Street, was one of the first to provide insight. "Blake," he said, rubbing greasy hands on a rag as if the name itself had sullied his shop. "Stay away from that one. People around here know better than to cross him. But if you're asking, it ain't no surprise you're sniffing around his place now. He's always been, I don't know, wrong somehow. Cold eyes, colder intentions." "What kind of business did he run, if you can even call it that?" Rourke asked, leaning casually against the counter like this was just another routine question. "Loans, quick money, but not the kind anyone decent goes looking for," James said with a shake of his head. "It's like he could smell when you needed help, and he'd help, sure, but you'd regret asking for it within a week or two." "And the people who couldn't pay him back?" James hesitated, glancing toward the bay where one of his mechanics pretended not to listen. He shifted uncomfortably. "Ask me no more, officer. I ain't gonna dig a hole with him or you." If Morris Blake was feared by his lenders, he was loathed by his few neighbors. Esther Rothman, who lived just down the road from Blake's property, reluctantly agreed to talk as she nervously peered out from her front porch before speaking. "That man," she started, shaking her head. "I used to see him out there on his front steps smoking those god-awful cigarettes in the middle of the night like he didn't sleep, not ever. He'd just sit there, staring up at the sky or the road like he was waiting for something. I'd tell my son and grandkids to cross to the other side of the street if they even got near his place." "Did he ever," Carter paused, choosing his next words carefully, "approach you or threaten you in any way?" "Oh no, not to me, but—" Esther's voice trailed off and her wrinkled fingers tightened around the edges of her cardigan. "I've seen folks stop by his place, desperate, you know. You never see those same folks again after a while. I used to think maybe they moved on account of shame, but now—" Her voice cracked. "Am I wrong, officer? Is it Blake who's done this?" Carter didn't answer immediately. He just tipped his hat politely and assured Esther that they'd sort it all out. But deep down, he was starting to believe that Bellwood's boogeyman was more real than anyone wanted to admit. Blake's criminal tactics didn't stop at intimidation. As more evidence surfaced, it became gut-wrenchingly clear that intimidation wasn't just his tool, it was his game plan. Late payments resulted in tires slashed, car windows shattered, pets gone missing, and sometimes worse. In the most chilling cases, debtors simply disappeared. No calls to the police, no missing persons reports filed, just whispered warnings that someone had taken care of it. By the time a search warrant was issued for Blake's property, the anticipation among the police force was taut, like the moment before a storm. But Carter knew that Blake wouldn't just sit around waiting for them to come knocking. Guys like him don't stick around when trouble gets this close, Carter admitted, as his squad gathered near the edge of the overgrown yard. The farmhouse stood in front of them like a looming specter, its sagging walls and warped windows casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. They moved in carefully, weapons drawn. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of cigarettes and rotting wood. The old house felt like a crime scene even before the search began. In the living room, they found the safe, the same one that held the meticulous financial records tying Blake to the Harrison Pond victims. In the bedroom, they found piles of dusty clothes and uncashed checks from his clients. But in the back, inside a shed that Blake likely thought wouldn't be searched, they found the real horror. "Captain," Becker called out, her voice cracking slightly, "you need to see this." Carter followed her outside to the shed, bracing himself for whatever came next. Inside, hanging on the walls like some deranged collection, were personal effects. Purses, wallets, cheap watches, and Polaroids. Dozens of them. "These could be our missing victims," Becker whispered, horrified as she pointed to the wads of cash stuffed into envelopes with names scribbled across them. "He kept them," Carter said bitterly, gripping the edge of the doorframe. "He didn't just take their money, he took everything. Their lives, their dignity, and he wanted to remember it." But there was one problem. Morris Blake was gone. Tracking him became the next step, but Carter couldn't shake the feeling that their suspect wasn't running because of guilt. He was running because he enjoyed the chase, because he knew they'd follow. Chasing Morris Blake had disappeared into the Texas dust like a phantom. The minute the police linked his ledger of victims to the remains buried near the pond, he was gone, leaving behind a trail of wreckage and a haunting silence. By the time Carter and his team rolled up to his farmhouse with a search warrant, it was like Blake had evaporated, taking any hope of an easy arrest with him. "Goddamn coward," Rourke muttered, as he scanned the abandoned farmhouse. The sound of crickets and the distant hum of cicadas filled the heavy silence. "He's not stupid," Carter replied dryly, his boots digging into the gravel driveway as he adjusted his sidearm. "Guys like Blake don't just run, they plan. He knew we were coming." Becker crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on the overgrown fields that stretched out behind the house. "You think he's still in Bellwood?" Carter breathed out hard through his nose like a bull sizing up a fight. "Nah. He's smarter than that. He's got a head start, probably a fake ID and a plan to lay low until this blows over. The question is, where the hell does a guy like Blake think he can disappear?" Becker raised an eyebrow, gesturing toward the farmhouse. "A hovel like this, Captain? My guess, he's not aiming for the Ritz. He's probably holed up in some rundown motel off the grid, still close enough to watch what's happening here." Carter nodded slowly, his jaw tight. It made sense. Blake wasn't some random junkie on a desperate run. He was organized, methodical. Staying close to Bellwood would give him the leverage he wanted, keeping an eye on the investigation, staying one step ahead. By sundown, Carter convened his officers under the makeshift, tent-turned command center. A large Texas map had been pinned to the wall, dotted with thumbtacks marking locations where Blake might try to hide, marginalized towns, backwater motels, and highway truck stops. The hum of fans and walkie-talkies filled the room as Carter stood at the center, staring down the map like it was a game board, and Blake was daring him to make the first move. "Here's what we know," Carter began, slapping a thick black marker into his palm. "Blake's got at least 24 hours ahead of us. From the evidence we pulled at his house, he's been planning for this, or something like it, for years. Fake IDs, burner phones, enough cash to slip through the cracks. He's already in the wind." Hayes, standing near the back of the tent, raised a hand with that characteristic nervous energy. "Captain, are we sure he's still in state? A guy like Blake, this feels like Louisiana territory, guns for hire, swamp country. He could disappear into the bayou, no problem." Becker, as always, wasn't buying into conjecture. She raised a hand, motioning for Rourke, who laid down a grainy still image over the map. Security footage from a nearby gas station. It showed a man in a ball cap and a denim jacket, face barely visible, paying with cash. "This was 4 hours ago," Becker said, tapping the edge of the photo with her finger. "This is him. He bought diesel fuel and food supplies at a gas station just outside Bellwood. He's not driving to Louisiana. He's staying local. My guess? He's heading for the deer camps or abandoned properties along the river north of here. Carter studied the photo carefully, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. He's got a pattern, he said after a long pause. Blake doesn't hide where he can bury himself. He hides where he can watch. The man spent most of his life hunting the desperate. My money's on him finding a spot where he's got a front row seat to watch us scramble. The first night of the manhunt was grueling. Officers fanned out across back roads and fringe areas surrounding the town, scouting creeks, dirt paths, and wildlife clearings. The radio chatter was static-heavy, filled with dead ends and sightings that amounted to nothing. "Nothing out here but jackrabbits, Captain," Rourke mumbled into his comm unit from his cruiser. "You sure this guy didn't just sprout wings and take off?" Carter pressed the button on his own unit, his eyes scanning the darkened trees ahead from the passenger seat of the lead car. "Keep your eyes open. Blake's been living around these parts for years. He knows it better than we do." The deeper they pushed into the remote areas of the Texas countryside, the more anxiety settled over the team. Every creaking branch and rustling thicket felt like it came with Blake's shadow attached. Then came the first break. "This is Hayes!" The officer's voice crackled nervously over the radio. "I've got an abandoned vehicle roughly 2 miles off the highway, Dirt Road 47. It's the same truck we pulled plates on from his property." Carter sat up, gripping the receiver. "Do not approach on your own, Hayes. Wait until we rendezvous." "Understood, Captain," came the reply, though the slight quiver in Hayes's voice didn't inspire confidence. When Carter, Becker, and Rourke arrived minutes later, the scene looked eerily quiet. Blake's rusted-out truck was parked at an angle, as though it had been abandoned hastily. Dust clouds still lingered slightly in the air, as if the vehicle hadn't been here long. Carter stepped out of his cruiser cautiously, flashlight in hand, his weapon resting against his hip. "Spread out. Check the property. Becker, you're with me." They approached the truck first, its cab empty, but the faint smell of sweat and cigarette smoke still clinging to the interior. A torn map lay on the passenger seat, red lines marking secondary roads, routes that snake through Bellwood's woods and rivers. "He's on foot," Becker murmured. Carter nodded grimly. "He's got a head start, but not much. Get the dogs out here. He's playing a dangerous game now, and we're not letting him win." For 3 days, the search for Blake evolved into a cat-and-mouse hunt through the backwoods of rural Texas. Police used tracking dogs, drones with thermal imaging, and even local volunteers to comb creek beds and abandoned barns. But Blake was slippery. Every lead felt like it brought them just close enough to see his shadow, only for it to vanish again. Each recovery of evidence, a discarded cigarette butt, half a protein bar wrapper, muddy boot prints, only confirmed how close Blake was. "He's toying with us," Rourke said one night as he and Carter leaned against the hood of their cruiser, watching searchlights sweep across the riverbank. "Knows how to stay near enough just to keep us chasing." Carter didn't respond immediately. He stared into the woods, his jaw locked tight. "We'll corner him. The more desperate he gets, the more mistakes he'll make." The mistake finally came on the 4th day, when a hunter stumbled upon a makeshift camp near Cedar Lake, about 15 miles outside Bellwood. It was crude, a tarp strung between 2 trees, a small fire pit, and bags of supplies that matched the ones Blake had purchased days earlier. "He's digging in," Becker muttered as she examined the scene. "But he's not far." Carter's radio buzzed then. Hayes's voice came through, this time with a clearer tone. "Captain, we've got a positive sighting about half a mile north of the camp. I swear, this time it's him." Carter wasted no time. "Hold your position. We're closing in." The chase was over. Morris Blake wasn't going any further. The tense confrontation. By the 4th day of the manhunt, tensions among Captain Carter's team were running high. The trail had gone cold so many times they began to wonder if Blake was even human. Every piece of evidence, from muddy boot prints to scattered supplies, was a breadcrumb in what felt like a calculated game. Morris Blake wasn't just hiding. He was watching, taunting them, staying one step ahead as though he knew their every move. But when Hayes reported a sighting near Cedar Lake, everything changed. "Captain, I've got eyes on him, half a mile north of the campsite." Hayes's voice crackled through the radio. "He's moving slower now, but it's definitely him. Same denim jacket, same hat." "Hold your position," Carter snapped, his usual calm giving way to urgency. "Don't engage under any circumstances. We're coming to you." He turned to Becker and Rourke, who were already climbing into their vehicles. "He's tired, and he knows he's running out of options. This might get ugly." The narrow dirt road to Cedar Lake was flanked by thick woods on either side, the kind of eerie Texas wilderness where the silence felt heavy. Carter's cruiser bounced over potholes, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest like a stone. "This is it, isn't it?" Becker asked from the passenger seat, her voice low but steady. Carter didn't take his eyes off the road. "One way or another, it ends today. Either we get him, or he makes his last stand. Either way, we're done chasing ghosts." As they approached the coordinates Hayes had given, they killed the headlights and parked just out of sight. From here, it would have to be on foot. The team fanned out in practiced precision, the crunch of dry leaves under their boots the only sound. Each officer gripped their weapon tightly, flashlights cutting through the dense underbrush. Then they saw it, the dilapidated shell of an old hunting lodge hidden deep within the trees. Its roof sagged under years of neglect and broken windows dotted its facade like black, empty eyes. This was where Morris Blake had made his stand. Carter raised his hand, signaling Becker and Rourke to flank the structure while Hayes and two other officers covered the rear. He stepped forward cautiously, his Glock drawn, his voice steady but firm. "Morris Blake," he called out. "This is Captain Daniel Carter with the Bellwood Police Department. We know you're inside. Come out with your hands up." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then a voice, low and raspy, called back from within the shadows of the lodge. "Well, Captain, I was wondering when you'd show up." Blake stepped into the doorway, the dim light catching the glint of a knife in his right hand. His denim jacket was torn and mud-streaked, his face gaunt but calm. He looked like a man with nothing to lose, a predator cornered yet still dangerous. "You've made quite the mess for yourself," Carter said, keeping his weapon trained on Blake's chest. His voice betrayed none of the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "But it's over now. Drop the knife, Blake. Let's end this quiet." Blake chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. "Quiet? Ain't nothing about this quiet, Captain. You think I didn't know you'd come for me? You think I didn't plan for this?" "Don't do this," Carter warned. "Whatever you think you've got left, it's not worth dying for." At that, Blake's smile faded. A colder, darker expression took its place. "Dying? I've been dead a long time, Captain. People like me, we don't die. We rot. And you're just a man trying to fight the inevitable. You got no idea how deep your little pond goes, do you?" Before Carter could react, Blake darted back inside the lodge, slamming the door behind him. The officers moved into action immediately, encircling the building as Carter barked orders into his radio. "Blake's armed and barricaded. Watch the exits. He's not getting out." From inside, Blake's voice rang out again, taunting. "How long you gonna play this game, Captain? You come in here, you won't like what you find. Ain't nothing left except me and my mess. You think you're ready for that?" Carter ignored the bait. "Blake, you've got one chance to walk out of here alive. Drop the knife and step outside. You're surrounded. There's no way out." There was silence, and then the sound of crashing furniture echoed from inside. Blake wasn't planning to surrender. "Damn it, he's barricading himself," Rourke growled, his shotgun at the ready. "We got a breach plan, Cap?" Carter's jaw tightened. "Last thing we need is a shootout. Hold positions. Let me talk to him." "Talk?" Becker shot him a look. "He's not exactly the negotiating type. He's gonna take this as far as he can go." "That gives us an edge," Carter replied, his tone hard. "Men like Blake, they're all ego. They want control. If I can keep him talking, it buys us time." Carter approached the door, his weapon lowered just enough to seem non-threatening. He spoke loudly, his voice cutting through the still air. "Morris," he called out, "you said I don't know how deep this goes, so tell me. Help me understand. You've got my attention." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door creaked slightly, just enough for Blake's shadowed face to appear through the crack. "You think talking's gonna fix this?" Blake spat, but his voice had softened, as if part of him wanted to be heard. "You think any of it matters? People like me, we're just a consequence, a side effect. You dig deep enough, you'll see. You're part of it too." "Blake," Carter said carefully, inching closer. "Whatever you've done, it doesn't have to end like this. You want to talk consequences? Fine, let's talk. But you've got to put down the knife. Nobody else needs to die today." Blake let out a shaky breath, his grip loosening on the blade. For a second, it looked like he might surrender, but then his eyes darted to the tree line, and Carter recognized the shift in his demeanor. Blake wasn't going down without a fight. "Don't do it, Morris," Carter warned, his weapon rising again. "I'm telling you, don't!" Blake lunged forward, slashing wildly as Carter sidestepped and tackled him to the ground. The knife clattered against the wooden floor as the two men wrestled, the confined space of the doorway amplifying every sharp breath and grunt. Within seconds, Becker and Rourke were on them, pinning Blake's arms and forcing him into submission. He thrashed and spat like a wounded animal, his voice a guttural growl. "You think locking me up changes anything?" Blake snarled as they cuffed him. "You think you've won? You don't know anything!" Carter knelt beside him, his face inches from Blake's as he caught his breath. "You're right, Blake. I don't know everything. But I know this. You're done. Whatever secrets you think you're hiding, they're coming with us." As Blake was hauled to his feet and led away, the officers exchanged a quiet sense of relief. The chase was finally over, but Carter felt no victory, only the weight of the darkness that Blake had left behind. "Morris Blake," he muttered to himself as he watched the man disappear into the back of the police van. "You're right about one thing. This goes deeper than I thought." For Carter, the job wasn't over. Blake might have been captured, but the truth he carried still loomed like a shadow over Bellwood. And Carter wasn't about to let it stay buried. The chilling confession. The interrogation room at Bellwood's small police station was a harsh contrast to the humid chaos of the manhunt. The stark white walls and single buzzing overhead light created an atmosphere of suffocating stillness. Across the steel table, Morris Blake sat handcuffed, his mud-smeared denim jacket hanging loosely around his wiry frame. He looked almost serene, leaning back with a faint smirk on his lips, as if the weight of being caught had lifted something from his soul. He wasn't scared, he wasn't rattled. If anything, he seemed amused. Captain Carter stood in the doorway for a few seconds, reading the room before stepping inside. The smell of sweat and stale cigarette smoke wafted over from Blake, who sat forward slightly, his chained wrists resting on the table. Carter closed the door, the noise echoing loudly in the otherwise silent room. "Let's cut the bullshit," Carter began, dropping a manila folder on the table between them. Its contents spilled halfway open, revealing crime scene photographs, bones unearthed from the dirt, the mangled remains of lives once lived. "You know why you're here, Morris. You know we've got you dead to rights, but now you're gonna tell us why you did it." Blake eyed the photographs with a slight tilt of his head, his lips curling into a sneer. "Why?" he repeated, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. He leaned back again, the chain on his cuffs rattling as he gestured lazily toward the photos. "Why does anyone do anything, Captain? Maybe it's habit, maybe it's need, maybe it's just fun." Carter didn't flinch, though his fingers twitched slightly as he resisted the urge to slam a fist into the table. "Don't play coy with me, Blake," he said, his tone dangerously steady. 5 bodies, all buried out by the Harrison Pond. Every one of them tied to your ledger. You kept records, goddammit. Names, amounts owed, those weren't random and they sure as hell weren't accidents. What the hell were you thinking? Blake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head slowly. "You're looking at it all wrong, Captain. You think this was about the money? Nah, money's just the excuse. A man like me, I don't get my kicks from dollar signs. No, sir, I get my kicks from teaching lessons." Carter's jaw tightened. "Lessons?" Blake locked eyes with him now, his gaze sharp and cold like an animal calculating its next strike. "People think they can take. They think they can cheat you, use you, step all over you when you're not looking, so I gave him reason to think twice, put the fear back in him. That's all this world runs on, Captain, fear and respect. Lose one, you lose the other." Becker, who was watching from behind the two-way mirror, glanced toward Rourke standing beside her. "He's feeding us lines," she muttered, trying to make it sound like this was some kind of moral crusade. "Yeah, well," Rourke replied, his arms crossed. "It's only moral if you forget the bodies in the ground." Carter leaned forward now, planting both hands firmly on the table. His voice dropped, each word laced with the venom of restrained anger. "You didn't just teach lessons, Blake. You killed people. You put them in the ground like garbage, people with families, people who begged you for help. What kind of monster calls that a lesson?" Blake's smirk widened just slightly, as though Carter had walked right into his game. "You call it killing, I call it cleaning up. These people were already buried, Captain. Drowning in debt, drowning in their own bad choices. Hell, I just sped up the process." Carter slammed a fist down on the table this time, the sound reverberating through the small room. "Don't give me that righteous son of a bitch act," he barked. "You're not God. You don't get to decide who lives or dies, so drop the smug act and tell me the damn truth. Why?" For the first time, Blake's expression faltered, if only briefly. His smirk softened into something colder. He leaned in closer to Carter, his voice dropping just enough to make the moment unbearably intimate. "You really want to know?" Blake whispered. "The truth? Fine. I'll give it to you, plain and simple. It wasn't just business, Captain. It's never just business. It was personal. Every one of them out there, everybody you dug up, they owed me more than money. They owed me for the nights I didn't sleep, for the hours spent worrying if they were gonna double-cross me, for the times I looked at 'em and felt like they were laughing in my goddamn face. His voice grew harsher now, his composed exterior cracking just slightly. So, yeah, I buried 'em. Gave them something to laugh about 6 feet under. You think that makes me a monster? Hell, monsters get things done. Monsters don't get used, and they don't leave loose ends. Behind the mirror, Becker's face had gone pale. Jesus Christ, she muttered. Rourke's expression was grim. Yeah, he's unhinged, but he's not out of control. He believes every damn word he's saying. Carter straightened slightly, masking the unease tightening in his chest. He wasn't about to let Blake see how deeply those words hit. Instead, he grabbed the manila folder and flipped to another photo, this time of the leather wallet recovered near Victim C's grave. Tell me about him, Carter said, sliding the photo in front of Blake. Blake glanced at the image, the smirk returning to his lips as he leaned back again. Ah, Charlie, he said with a mockingly wistful tone. Poor kid. Big ideas, not much else. Thought he could run one of his little side hustles, make some quick cash, and forget about the 10 grand he owed me. Hell, I even let him slide for a few extra weeks, but you know what they say, give him an inch. Let me guess, Carter said flatly. He refused to pay. Blake laughed. Refused? Nah, he didn't have to. He ran, Captain, like a scared little rabbit, and you know what happens to rabbits, right? Sooner or later they get caught. The room fell silent for a long moment, the weight of Blake's words hanging thick in the air. Carter stared at him, his face unreadable. Finally, he pushed the chair back and stood. You're done, Morris, he said quietly, his tone devoid of the rage that had flared just moments earlier. You think you've won something here, that you've got all the power, but we've got every name you wrote down, every record you tried to keep tight, and when we're finished, there won't be a shadow left for you to hide in. Blake's smirk returned as Carter turned to leave. You can dig up all the dirt you want, Captain, he called after him. Doesn't change the fact that dirt's where most people end up anyway. Might as well get used to it. Becker met Carter in the hallway outside, her expression grim. He's not going to give us anything useful without a fight, she said. He already gave it to us, Carter replied, his tone distant. He told us exactly who he is. Now we just have to prove it to the world. As the door to Blake's cell slammed shut, Carter felt the weight of the man's words pressing harder than ever. There was no remorse in Morris Blake, no hint of humanity, just a man who saw the world as disposable, and had taken it upon himself to do the disposing. The confession may have been chilling, but Carter knew the nightmare wasn't over. The bodies might have been buried, but the secrets Blake held had only started coming to the surface, and Carter wasn't sure the town of Bellwood or himself was ready for what they were about to uncover next. The trial and the harsh sentence. The courtroom was packed from front to back, with almost every seat in the gallery filled by journalists, locals from Bellwood, and family members of the victims who had long waited for justice. The sight of Morris Blake entering in his orange prison jumpsuit, hands cuffed and escorted by 2 stern-faced officers, sent a ripple of murmuring through the crowd. Blake's usual smirk was gone, replaced by an unreadable expression. A man who had finally been caged but still refused to lose his aura of defiance. Captain Carter sat in one of the back rows, not as a police officer that day, but as someone who needed to see this through. He had been close to the case for too long, his mind haunted by Blake's chilling words in the interrogation room. Though Carter possessed a steely resolve, there was no denying that seeing Blake walk freely into court, even in chains, set his jaw tight. This guy looks like he's about to call the shots in his own trial, Rourke muttered, leaning over from the seat beside Carter. I wouldn't put it past him to try. He's got that smug air about him. Let him try, Carter replied, his voice low, eyes locked on Blake as he approached the defendant's table. The evidence speaks louder than his mouth ever could. As Blake sat down beside his attorney, he scanned the room casually like someone preparing to hold court. His attorney, a wiry man in his late 40s, leaned in to whisper something, but Blake barely acknowledged him. It was clear that Morris Blake wasn't interested in defense strategies or legal maneuvers. This was his stage, and in his mind, the world was still revolving around him. The judge entered shortly after, her gavel banging once to call the court to order. Judge Madison Grayson was a woman with a no-nonsense reputation, her sharp features and piercing stare earning her the nickname Iron Grayson throughout the state's legal circles. Let's get started, she said plainly, glancing toward the prosecution. State your case. The lead prosecutor, District Attorney Eleanor Kincaid, began her opening statement with clarity and precision. She didn't mince words. "Ladies and gentlemen," she started, stepping slowly toward the jury box, "what you're about to hear over the course of this trial is a story of manipulation, greed, and the calculated destruction of innocent lives. Morris Blake, sitting right there," she pointed with calm certainty toward the defendant, "exploited the desperation of vulnerable men and women for his own gain, but his crimes weren't just about money. They were about power. They were about control. And when his victims couldn't pay, Morris Blake didn't just threaten them, he silenced them forever." Kincaid paused for a moment to let her words settle, glancing across the jurors' serious expressions and the sea of grieving faces in the gallery. Then she continued, "Over the next few weeks, we will demonstrate beyond any shadow of a doubt that Morris Blake is responsible for the horrific murders of at least 5 individuals. We will show you his ledger, his trophies, and the physical evidence uncovered in his so-called safe. But more than that, we will show you the pain, the suffering, and the enduring loss he caused, not just for his victims but for their families, for their community, and for every single person who has ever fought to break free from the grip of fear." As Kincaid returned to her table, Carter's eyes flicked toward Blake, wondering if anything at all, registered as human emotion on the man's face. But Blake, calm as a predator in the tall grass, sat without flinching. The trial unfolded over several weeks, and each passing day peeled back another layer of Blake's darkness. Witnesses came forward with trembling voices to recount their personal nightmares with him. "I thought he was helping me," Amanda Valentine, sister of victim D, said tearfully on the stand. I thought he was giving me a chance to get my brother out of trouble, but he just made it worse. When my brother couldn't pay him back, he disappeared, just like that." "I called and called, but no one ever answered. And then they found his body." Amanda broke down, clutching a tissue as the prosecutor gently guided her through her testimony. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen, and her voice cracked under the weight of the memories. The courtroom hung heavy with her words, the murmurs from the gallery silenced by the stark reality of her pain. Blake's defense tried to spin the narrative, arguing that blame for the victims' financial misfortunes lay elsewhere, that they had made their own choices, that they were already drowning before Blake ever came along. "He offered assistance," Blake's defense attorney said at one point, pacing in front of the jury. "Was it unconventional? Yes. Risky? Surely, but it was not murder. My client simply extended a hand, and those who took it, well, their fates were decisions of their own making." The callousness of the argument drew audible gasps from the courtroom, and even Judge Grayson raised her eyebrows in obvious disdain. Kincaid seized the opportunity in her rebuttal, her voice sharp with conviction. "Morris Blake didn't offer assistance," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "He offered debt with strings soaked in blood, and when those strings pulled tight, he didn't extend a hand to help, he used his to bury them." The families of the victims delivered impact statements that would haunt the courtroom long after the trial. One by one, mothers, fathers, siblings, and children of those lost described in brutal, humanizing detail what Blake had taken from them. "You didn't just kill my son," Michael Harper, father of victim B, said, standing tall despite his trembling hands. "You killed me. You killed a part of me that will never come back. And when you sit there with that smirk on your face, like this whole thing's beneath you, I want you to know, this isn't about winning for you anymore. This is about a community standing up and saying, no more." By the time Harper sat back down, his voice had cracked beyond repair, and many in the gallery were openly wiping at their eyes. When Morris Blake finally took the stand, the courtroom tilted into an even darker place. Blake was neither apologetic nor remorseful. If anything, he fed off the attention, his cold, detached tone sending chills down everyone's spines. "Do I regret what I did?" he asked rhetorically, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Not a damn thing." Kincaid leaned in sharply during her cross-examination, her voice cutting through Blake's bravado. "Morris Blake, are you telling this court that you feel absolutely no remorse for the lives you've taken?" Blake leaned forward, his cuffs clinking on the wooden stand. "Remorse? Remorse is for people who make mistakes. I didn't make mistakes, sweetheart. I made decisions." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was clear and unshaken. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Morris Blake, guilty on all counts." The relief and grief in the room erupted simultaneously. Tears flowed, whispers filled the air. Blake, however, remained eerily calm as the judge read her verdict. "Morris Blake, you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection," Judge Grayson announced, her voice firm but measured. "Your actions caused immeasurable pain and suffering, and this court will see that justice is served." For once, Blake's smirk faltered. It was only a flicker, but Carter caught it. As the courtroom emptied out, Captain Carter lingered in the back. Becker approached him, her own face betraying a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," she said softly. Carter shook his head slightly. "Not over. Not really. The wounds this guy left behind don't disappear with a verdict. It's just the beginning for us. For those families." Becker nodded solemnly, following his gaze toward Amanda Valentine, whose tear-streaked face seemed both broken and resolved. For the town of Bellwood, justice wasn't just a sentence. It was a step toward healing the scars left by Morris Blake, a shadow no prison or death row could fully erase. Lessons from the Bellwood case. The dust had begun to settle in Bellwood, but the echoes of Morris Blake's crime still lingered in every corner of the town. The trial might have ended with a definitive verdict and a harsh sentence, but the emotional wounds Blake left behind felt like they would take generations to heal. Bellwood's residents, once united by the shared simplicity and quiet of small-town life, were now bound by a different thread, a collective trauma, and the hard-won wisdom that came with it. Captain Carter sat in the Bellwood diner late one afternoon, nursing a cup of black coffee gone lukewarm. The place was nearly empty, except for a few farmers murmuring in the corner, and a waitress flipping idly through a notebook. The plate of untouched pie in front of him wasn't unusual. Eating hadn't been much of a priority since the trial ended. Across the red vinyl seat from him sat Sergeant Rourke, who stirred too much sugar into his coffee, then leaned back with a sigh. "Well," Rourke started, breaking the silence, "if I never have to hear the name Morris Blake again, I think I'll sleep easy for the rest of my life." Carter gave him a weary look. "You really think it's that simple?" Rourke tilted his head, shrugging. "The guy's locked up, waiting on death row. He's out of the picture, Cap. What's left to worry about?" Carter tapped a finger on his coffee cup, the sound dull and steady against the ceramic. "It's not him I'm worried about, it's everything he left behind." The Bellwood case had torn apart the illusion of safety in their small town. For decades, people in Bellwood believed their biggest problems were things like a bad harvest or noisy teenagers loitering outside the hardware store. But Morris Blake had shattered that assumption, making everyone painfully aware of the cracks in their community's foundation. Blake hadn't just exploited individuals, he'd exploited an entire system. The shadowy world of illegal loans and desperate financial decisions illuminated a reality that no one wanted to admit. People in Bellwood were struggling. Bills were unpaid, crops had yielded less than expected, medical expenses piled up, and jobs were scarce. Blake's rise to infamy had only been possible because the system that was supposed to protect people had failed. The banks wouldn't help, the government felt too far away, and when you have nowhere else to go, a man like Morris Blake starts to look like a solution. Carter rubbed his temples as he recalled the statements from the trial, not just from the families of the victims, but from other townsfolk who admitted, shame-faced, that they had once called Blake for a loan. "Every single one of them," Carter said, shaking his head slightly. "So embarrassed to admit they were in trouble, embarrassed to ask for help. That's what a guy like Blake feeds on, shame." He turned desperation into fear, and fear into silence. Rourke shrugged, sticking a toothpick into his mouth. "That's the thing though, Cap, it's not just Bellwood. Small towns all over the country are full of folks who can't make ends meet. They're scraping by, one missed mortgage payment away from losing everything. It's not like anybody offers them a way out either. Someone like Blake swoops in and it's game over." "Doesn't make it right," Carter muttered. "We let him thrive because no one wanted to say out loud how bad things really were." Rourke leaned forward this time, his expression sobering. "Yeah, but what do you do about that? What's the damn lesson we're supposed to take from all this?" Carter gave him a long, thoughtful look before answering, his voice quieter now. "You start talking. People in this town, hell, everywhere, they've got to stop feeling like asking for help is some kind of weakness. It's not about pride. It's about survival. If we learned anything from that bastard Blake, it's that silence kills." Rourke nodded, though his expression was skeptical. "You really think talking would have stopped him?" Carter thought about it for a moment. The truth was complicated. Maybe not him, but his victims? Yeah, it might have saved some of them. If they weren't too afraid to tell someone what was going on or too ashamed to admit they couldn't pay him back, they might still be here. Rourke frowned, tossing the toothpick onto the plate in front of him. "So what? We tell everyone to start shouting their problems in the middle of Main Street?" "Not exactly," Carter said, smirking lightly. "But we need to make room for people to admit they need help. A better support system, better ways to catch people before they fall off the edge. If they had somewhere else to turn, if they knew someone was listening, maybe guys like Blake wouldn't have so much power. For a town like Bellwood, that lesson was already beginning to take root. In the months following the trial, the community came together in ways Carter hadn't seen before. The church began operating a free debt counseling service. Local farmers pooled resources to create an emergency fund for families dealing with bad harvests. Even the Bellwood Bank instituted new lending programs for lower-income families, an effort to rebuild trust after decades of being seen as just another institution turning its back on those in need. But it wasn't just local businesses that changed. The people of Bellwood were slowly, reluctantly starting to talk. Friends confided in each other when they were struggling. Neighbors checked in. The gossip that once fueled petty small-town drama now served a better purpose, keeping each other safe. One afternoon, Carter overheard a conversation outside the grocery store. A young couple had missed a rent payment, and instead of brushing it off or hiding it, they were talking to an older man about finding help. "How's that for a start?" Carter murmured to himself as he climbed into his cruiser. Sitting across from Rourke in that diner, Carter let out a long sigh. Blake's gone, but the conditions that allowed him to exist, that's on us to fix. One case, one trial, doesn't undo all the damage. "So what's next, Cap?" Rourke asked with a small smile. Carter thought about it for a moment before responding. "Next," Carter said, his voice firm, "we keep the light shining. No more shadows for people like Blake to hide in. And no more victims feeling like they've got to fight the fight alone." The Bellwood case became something of a cautionary tale for small towns across the country, a reminder that darkness doesn't just descend overnight. It grows quietly, in the cracks left behind by pride, fear, and apathy. But it also proved that no matter how bad things get, a community willing to come together can start to repair even the deepest wounds. For Bellwood, that repair was far from complete. The scars of Morris Blake would always run deep. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Closing a dark chapter. The town of Bellwood had known peace once, a kind of idyllic small-town stillness many other places had long left behind. That peace had been shattered by Morris Blake, and there was no pretending otherwise. His capture, trial, and death sentence marked the end of a reign of terror woven in silence and fear, but the shadow of his deeds lingered long after. For the townspeople and for Captain Carter, this wasn't as simple as shutting the door on a grisly past. It was about picking up the pieces and figuring out how to move forward. A week after the trial concluded, Carter found himself standing by the pond, now still and undisturbed as it reflected the soft amber light of a fading Texas sunset. The yellow police tape that once draped across the scene was long gone, replaced by a subtle, somber quiet, as if the place itself knew what had happened there. The Harrison property was nothing more than an empty lot now. Big Jim and Martha had sold it to the town council, unable to stomach living a single night more beside the field of horrors they'd accidentally uncovered. Sergeant Rourke approached with a slow pace, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He carried a stained thermos under one arm and shoved his free hand deep into his pocket as he neared Carter. "Figured you'd be out here," Rourke said, his voice softer than usual. "Did you?" Carter replied, not turning to face him. He kept his eyes on the pond's surface, watching as the last traces of sunlight glinted off the water. "Seems like the kind of place people avoid these days." Rourke unscrewed the thermos lid, poured a modest cup of coffee, and handed it to Carter. "A place like this doesn't stay quiet forever. People forget. Maybe not about the details, but about how it felt." Carter took the coffee without a word, the steam curling faintly in the cool evening air. For a long time, neither man spoke. They just stood there, side by side, with the silence of the pond settling over them like a heavy blanket. Eventually, Rourke tilted his head toward the water. "You know, they're talking about turning this place into a memorial park. Something nice, clean it up, plant some trees, couple of benches for people to sit, all that poetic crap." Carter raised an eyebrow. "A park? Better than letting it rot," Rourke shrugged. "Maybe a plaque or something. Something simple to remind people what happened here without scaring the hell out of them." He smirked faintly. "And hey, maybe it'll help people forget it was ever Blake's dumping ground." Carter blew on his coffee, considering the thought. "People shouldn't forget," he said finally. "Not what happened, and definitely not how it happened." Rourke's smirk faded. "No one's forgetting, Cap. Not really. But people can't live with this hanging over their shoulders forever either. The town's got scars because of him, yeah, but scars fade. Just gotta decide if you're gonna spend the rest of your life tracing those scars or living outside of them." Carter didn't respond right away. Over the past few weeks, the aftermath of the trial had weighed on him more than the hunt for Blake ever had. With a killer locked away and families seeing justice served, he had expected some semblance of closure. But instead, it felt like Bellwood had been hollowed out, its wounds laid bare for everyone to see, with no clear path to healing. They both turned when the sound of children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. A small group of kids was running along the far edge of the Harrison property, kicking an old soccer ball between them. One of them, a girl no older than 9, stopped to wave at the two officers before chasing after her friends. Carter watched them disappear toward the horizon. "Guess the kids are coping just fine," Rourke said, sipping his thermos. "Maybe there's something in that. Kids don't overthink. Things get dark. They find a way back to the light without all the hang-ups." Carter arched a brow. "Since when did you start waxing philosophical, Rourke?" The sergeant chuckled, patting his stomach. "Must have been all the coffee." Back at the center of town, signs of recovery were starting to blossom. The diner, once filled with hushed whispers about the case, had returned to its usual soft hum of gossip and chatter. Church services were more crowded than before, though the topics of the sermons had shifted toward forgiveness, resilience, and rebuilding trust. Carter and Rourke made their way toward Main Street, passing the now notorious Harrison property like two weary soldiers retreating after battle. "You getting used to hearing about the Bellwood case everywhere?" Rourke asked, hands jammed into his coat pockets. "More than I'd like," Carter admitted. The case had drawn national headlines, framing Bellwood as a place forever marked by Blake's crimes. Cable news anchors dissected every grisly detail over vibrant lower third graphics, while podcasts churned out theories about Blake's psychology and whether his crimes carried deeper meaning. "It's like they're trying to turn the guy into some kind of folk legend," Rourke muttered bitterly. "A small-town boogeyman that preyed on the desperate. Makes me sick." "Let 'em talk," Carter replied after a moment. "None of it changes what really happened. They don't know the people involved. They don't see what it did to this town." "No, they sure don't." At the town council's last meeting, several community leaders had begun discussing ways to prevent another Morris Blake. A new initiative to provide better financial advice and low-interest loans had been proposed. The town's small bank, once criticized for its inaccessibility, had partnered with local churches to offer debt counseling sessions. People like Amanda Valentine, the sister of one of Blake's victims, had started leading support groups to give neighbors a place to share their struggles. "It's not much," Carter had told the council, "but the only way we heal from this is if we stick together." Rourke brought it up again that evening, sitting across from Carter in the diner as they refueled with greasy burgers and fries. "You think those programs are actually going to work?" "Won't know until we try," Carter replied simply. "And what if people slip back into bad habits?" Rourke prodded. "Then we remind them what happened the last time someone tried to handle it alone," Carter said, fixing him with a steady gaze. "We show them we've got each other. That's how we make sure this doesn't happen again. Not just for the next 5 years, but for the next 50. As the weeks turned into months, the scars across Bellwood began to fade, not because of time alone, but because of the work the townspeople put in to reclaim their sense of safety. The Harrison property, once a grim reminder of tragedy, did become a memorial park after all. A single cherry blossom tree was planted, with a brass plaque at its base reading, "In memory of those we lost, and the voices that were silenced, may we never forget." One sunny afternoon, Carter drove past the park and saw Big Jim Harrison standing near the cherry tree, his wide frame hunched slightly as his fingers brushed against the plaque. Carter parked his squad car and approached carefully, not wanting to startle the man. "Jim," Carter said softly. "Captain," Jim replied, his voice weighed down with the same mix of grief and relief that Bellwood had carried since the trial. "Just stopping by. Couldn't help it, after everything." Carter stood beside him, looking up at the gentle curve of the tree's thin branches. "You and Martha doing okay?" Jim nodded slowly. "We're getting there. Still feels raw, but she says it's like a wound that's closed but still aches sometimes. Don't know if it'll stop aching. But maybe that's all right." As the wind rustled the leaves above them, Carter felt the ache Jim described, that dull throb of something broken but still healing. Bellwood's dark chapter might have ended, but it wasn't forgotten, and maybe that's what mattered most. For the first time in months, Carter smiled faintly. There was no undoing the past, but there was work to be done in the future. And for Bellwood, That was a start. If the town could survive Morris Blake, they could survive anything.